Old men don't fear the dark. Not the plain kind, anyway. They fear the kind of dark that remembers your name and keeps it. Out here in the Arizona territory, where the rail line thins into nothing and the sky hangs low like a tin lid, there's a place folks call Black Creek. People hear the word creek and think water, shade, cottonwoods, but Black Creek ain't that. Most days it doesn't run at all, and when it does, it runs mean. They named it Black Creek because the earth there bleeds, not red, black. A slow, shining pitch that rises up through cracks in the ground, like the land is trying to cough something out. In the noon heat, it looks like melted glass. At night, it looks like a doorway. That's where Jon Jensen came to be measured. Now, I didn't know Jon back when he first stepped into our dust. Most folks didn't. But I remember the first time I saw him, because a man like that doesn't just arrive. He settles into the world like a stone dropping into a well. No splash, just a deep change in the water. It was early morning, when the light is still honest and the shadows are long enough to tell the truth. The wind was pulling at everything it could grab, brush, fence wire, loose boards, and it carried that dry, bitter smell you get when the desert's been a week all night. I saw Jon standing at the edge of the tar seep, perfectly still, like he'd been planted there. His coat hung heavy on him, dust-stained and tired. The posture, it wasn't the posture of a drifter looking for luck. It was the posture of a man listening, like he could hear something coming that the rest of us were too busy surviving to notice. Above him, vultures floated in lazy circles, patient as bankers. They didn't flap much. They didn't have to. Out here, the sky does the work for him. Jon didn't look up, didn't wave him off, didn't act offended by the idea of being watched by birds that wait for death like it's a scheduled appointment. He just stood there, and the wind tugged at his coat like a child that wanted attention. Then he did something small, so small most people wouldn't even clock it. He slid a revolver out of his waistband, checked the cylinder with his thumb, and tucked it back like he was returning a tool to the proper hook in a shed. Not nervous, not showy, just ready. That's how I knew the land had called in a different kind of man. Now there was a boy, Tom Ibarra, 16, skinny as a fence slat, sun-cracked lips, and the kind of quiet eyes you get when you grow up watching grown men lose fights they started. His grandmother ran a little shop in town, sold nails, flour, lamp oil, sold a little comfort if you could afford it. That morning she sent Tom to fetch oil. Simple errand. Keep your head down, do what you're told, don't talk to strangers. That's how you stay alive long enough to become someone's old uncle. But Tom took the long way. See, there was a drunk hanging around the main boardwalk that week, a mean one, the kind that thinks throwing rocks at kids counts as entertainment. So Tom looped around the outskirts, cutting through scrub and broken ground, out past where the town sounds fade into wind. That's why he saw Jon first. Tom stopped behind a patch of brush and watched him. The boy didn't know Jon was Danish, didn't know anything about Europe, about old wars, about men who'd learned the hard way what a uniform can cost you. Tom only knew what desert boys know better than any preacher. When a stranger stands by a black hole in the ground like it's speaking to him, something bad is already in motion. For a long minute, nothing happened. Just wind, just light, just the slow, thick breathing of the land. And then Jon turned. Not quick, not startled. He turned like he decided to turn a full minute before his body bothered to follow. He looked toward town, not with hate, not with fear, with the calm focus of someone checking the wind before striking a match. Tom felt it too, something tightening in the air. That kind of silent pressure that shows up right before a storm breaks or right before a gunshot changes who a man is. And the wind, I swear, it carried a smell that didn't belong out there. Not creosote, not sage, something sharper. Train smoke, fresh dug earth, the smell of something arriving. Tom didn't move. He held the tin of lamp oil tight against his chest like it could protect him, like metal and kerosene could somehow stop trouble from finding him. He watched Jon's silhouette against that tar-stained ground, watched the vultures glide in wide circles overhead, and felt the strange certainty that the desert was keeping records, quietly, carefully, of who stood where and what they were about to do. You learn, after enough years, that the West doesn't shout its warnings, it whispers them. It slides them into your day like a splinter, small at first, easy to ignore, until it works its way deeper. That morning, Tom finally backed away, slow, careful, 1 foot at a time, trying not to snap a twig, trying not to let his breath get loud. And when he reached the safety of the trading shed, he didn't even go inside right away. He just stood there, staring out to the flats, like he expected Jon to vanish, or like he feared the man might look up and see him. But Jon didn't look toward the boy. He kept looking toward town, because whatever was coming, it wasn't coming for Tom. It was coming for Jon Jensen. And the thing about Black Creek, about that tar-stained ground and the vultures that circle it, is this: the place doesn't care if you're good. It doesn't care if you're trying. It doesn't care how far you traveled to start over. It only cares what you owe. Some men arrive in a town looking for work. Some arrive looking for land. Some arrive for forgiveness. Jon Jensen stood by the Black Seep like a man waiting to pay. And when the wind brought that faint smear of train smoke across the sky, it felt like the first note of a song nobody wanted to hear, because everyone knew how it ended. Not with applause, with silence, the kind that remembers. Before Black Creek ever learned Jon Jensen's name, before the tar pits and the vultures and all the trouble that followed, there were 2 brothers standing in a different kind of wind, one that smelled like salt water and coal smoke instead of dust. They were Danish boys once, farm boys, the kind that grow up with hands already rough from rope and wood, and backs that learn early how to carry weight without complaining. But Denmark had been bruised hard in the War of 1864, and when the borders shifted and the promises broke, the Jensens understood something plain. A small country can run out of room for its sons. So Jon and Peter did what a lot of men did in those years. They left. They didn't leave with speeches or flags. They left with a battered suitcase, a few folded shirts, and the kind of hope that doesn't fit neatly anywhere. At the docks, they watched the shoreline get smaller until it was only a thin line, and then not even that. The ocean did what the ocean always does. It made every man feel temporary. By the time they reached America, they were already learning the first lesson of the New World. Nobody here owes you understanding. You earn your place with sweat, or you don't earn it at all. They took work where they could find it. First, the rail camps, those loud, sun-blasted little towns of canvas and bad language that move along with the tracks like a traveling fever. Men swung sledgehammers from dawn to dusk. Spikes went into ties. Ties went into rails. Rails went across the land like someone trying to stitch the continent back together. Jon didn't talk much. Some men mistake silence for stupidity. Those men usually learn their mistake too late. But Peter, though, Peter talked enough for both of them. He had a way of laughing that made even the meanest foreman pause before swinging his anger. He told jokes in broken English, and if nobody laughed, he laughed anyway. Not because the jokes were good, most of them weren't, but because laughter was cheaper than whiskey and safer than fists. At night, when the work stopped and the men finally sat down, Jon would pull out paper and ink like they were sacred objects. He wrote letters across the Atlantic, slow, careful lines. He wrote to his wife, Marie. He wrote about the work, about the heat, about the strange wide sky that felt too big to belong to any one man. And sometimes he wrote to his son, Creston, who was small when Jon left and kept growing in Jon's mind like a shadow stretching longer every year. 7 years is a long time to be away from your own life. 7 years is long enough for a man to worry he'll come home, if you can call it home, and find that he's already been replaced. Jon carried that fear quietly, the way he carried everything. He didn't say it out loud, because saying it would make it real. After a while, the rail camps blurred into each other. Dust, sweat, canvas, iron. Then the brothers drifted south with a new rumor. Land. Always land. In the territory, land was the only promise that held its shape for more than 5 minutes. People said there was a place near something called Black Creek where a man could stake a claim and build a life that wouldn't be packed up and moved every season. They rode into that valley and found it looked like the world had been half finished and forgotten. Scrub and stone, wind that never apologized, a sky so bright it made your eyes ache. And the creek, well, the creek was more story than water.
Still, they staked their claim. They hammered a post into the dry ground, and that sound, wood meeting earth, felt like a sentence being written. They built a low house with a roof that complained in every storm. They stacked boards, dug holes, dragged timbers until their shoulders burned. The territory taught them its rules fast. Water was worth more than gold. A paper deed meant less than a loaded rifle. And if you wanted peace, you kept your voice down and your eyes open. Peter did the talking in town. He smiled, traded, bought nails and flour, learned enough English to charm and to bargain. Jon stayed quieter. He watched faces. He watched hands. He learned the rhythm of the place, the way trouble moved before it arrived. But even with the land and the work, Jon never stopped writing. He never stopped waiting. Then, one spring, a letter came that changed the air in his lungs. Marie was coming. Not someday. Now. She had boarded a ship, then a train, then another train. She was bringing Creston. The words on the page didn't feel real at first. They felt like the kind of dream you wake up from and spend the rest of the day chasing. Jon read the letter twice, then folded it carefully like it might tear if he breathed too hard. He didn't shout, he didn't celebrate. He only sat at the table for a long time, staring at the wood grain as if it were a map that could tell him how to get his life back. Peter was the one who broke the quiet. He slapped the table and said, "Then we go." He went into town and bought a tin of peppermints for the boy because he heard American kids liked them. He held the tin up like a prize. "Your son will think you're a rich man," Peter said. Jon's mouth twitched, barely. That was the closest he came to smiling in public. "I am, if they step off that train." They rode to Sable Junction, a whistle-stop station built of sun-bleached boards and stubbornness. It wasn't much, a platform, a water tower, a telegraph pole, and the smell of coal smoke clinging to everything. People waited with parcels and impatience. A dog barked at nothing in particular. The wind dragged dust along the boards like it was sweeping. Jon stood very still. Too still. Like if he moved, the moment might break. Peter bounced on his heels and tried to talk him into breathing. "You look like a man waiting for a firing squad," Peter murmured. Jon didn't answer, but his hands tightened around the peppermints tin until the metal creaked. Then, far off, the train whistle split the air. It came closer like a steel animal, hissing, rattling, dragging a veil of dust behind it. The platform boards trembled as the engine rolled in. Steam curled around boots and luggage. Voices rose, then softened again, because people know when something important is happening to someone else. And then Marie stepped down. She looked smaller than the picture Jon carried inside his head, but the center of her was the same. Straight spine, steady eyes, hands already reaching back as if to keep hold of the world behind her. Creston hopped down after her, a skinny boy with legs too long for his body and a face full of questions. He stared at the crowd first, then at the strange land around the station, like he couldn't decide whether to be impressed or afraid. Then he saw Jon. The boy stopped dead. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. It was the kind of quiet moment that makes a whole platform feel like it's holding its breath. Creston's eyes searched Jon's face, comparing him to a memory built from letters and stories. Jon dropped to one knee, not as a performance, not to be dramatic, but because his body knew what his heart needed. He opened his arms. Creston hesitated one more second, then ran. Jon caught him and held him hard enough that the boy's ribs must have squeaked. It wasn't a gentle hug, it was a desperate one, the kind where a man tries to prove with his arms that time can't steal what belongs to him. Marie stepped closer, her eyes wet but steady. She reached out like she was touching a person and a ghost at the same time. Jon lifted his head to look at her, and for a moment the whole world narrowed to the three of them, and a single shared breath. A few steps away, Peter turned his face aside, blinking too much. He pretended to study a baggage cart like it was the most fascinating thing he'd ever seen. Some men don't cry because they're too proud. Peter didn't cry because he didn't want to interrupt something sacred. When Jon finally released Creston enough for the boy to breathe, he introduced Peter to Marie with a simple nod. Peter offered a handshake, polite, careful, almost shy. Marie returned it, grateful without knowing exactly what she owed him. They loaded trunks onto a wagon. They checked straps. They adjusted shawls. Creston kept looking around like he might find America hiding behind a crate. And then they left the station, rolling out along the dusty road with the train steam fading behind them. Back in town later that day, people would talk about it in the general store. The reunion, the boy running, the way Jon Jensen held his family like he was afraid the wind might take them again. Folks passed a story around like it was a rare coin. But out here, happiness doesn't get to stay unchallenged for long. Not in the territory. Not on roads where a man can ride up beside you and decide your life is his for the taking. And that day, as the wheels turned and the dust rose behind them, there was already something else moving in the same direction, quiet as a shadow, patient as a vulture, the kind of trouble that doesn't knock.
By the time Jon Jensen finally had his wife's hand in his own again, the frontier was already sharpening its knives. 2 days of road lay between Sable Junction and Black Creek. 2 days of open desert, wagon ruts, and wind that never stops talking. Jon wanted to leave immediately, not because he was impatient, but because he could feel how fragile happiness is out there, how it can crack if you hold it too tight or too long. He didn't have a proper carriage, so he paid for space on a freight wagon headed toward the creek. It was the sort of ride folks took when they didn't have better options. A rough bench under a canvas shade, sacks and crates for company, and a driver with a red nose and an easy smile. Too easy, like a man who survived by not noticing danger until it was sitting in his lap. The trouble was, 2 other passengers were already aboard. They wore dust-colored coats and hats pulled low, and they carried themselves with the relaxed confidence of men who'd been violent enough times it didn't feel like a decision anymore. The kind of confidence that doesn't come from courage, it comes from practice. Jon clocked them immediately. Marie did too. She didn't know their language, but she knew their eyes. Creston, on the other hand, was still in that bright, excited haze children get when the world feels new. He kept looking out through the canvas opening, pointing at birds and rabbit tracks, asking questions in Danish that came tumbling out like marbles. Jon answered softly, grateful for the sound of his son's voice. He pointed toward the scrub and spoke about hawks and jackrabbits, about the way the land hides its life in plain sight. He promised hunting trips, like a father trying to lay new boards across a broken bridge. Peter should have been there beside them. Jon knew it. Marie knew it. But Peter had stayed behind at the station to collect delayed tools and nails. He'd smiled, promised he'd ride out at first light and catch up, and then he disappeared into the bustle of Sable Junction like a man stepping behind a curtain for a moment. That small separation, just a few hours, maybe less, was the first crack in the day, the kind you don't see until the whole thing gives way. The wagon rolled out into open desert, and for a while it was almost peaceful. Wheels creaked, leather straps complained, the horses' heads bobbed in that steady, tired rhythm. Heat shimmered on the horizon. The world looked empty, but the frontier is never empty. It's full of space, and space has a way of hiding things. Inside the wagon, the 2 strangers sat across from Jon's family, like they paid for the right to breathe the same air. One of them, Silas, kept watching Marie, not her face exactly, more like the line of her throat, the way her hair caught the light. He had a smile that belonged on a gambler, not a traveler. He pulled a dented flask from his coat and offered it to her. Marie shook her head politely. Silas smiled wider, like refusals were just a different kind of invitation. Jon answered in careful English. She is tired. Silas leaned in. I seem tired. That ain't tired. That's proud. Marie didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Her shoulders went stiff. Creston edged closer to her without realizing it. Jon leaned toward Marie and murmured in Danish, low enough that the men couldn't follow. He told her to take a sip, just a sip, not because he wanted her to drink, but because he wanted the moment to pass without sparking. It's a hard thing to explain to people who haven't lived under other people's tempers. Sometimes you swallow your pride the way you swallow bitter medicine, because you believe it might keep someone you love alive. Marie took the flask, sipped lightly, and handed it back. Her hand didn't shake, but her eyes stayed sharp. Jon watched the men, measuring the distance to the wagon edge, the angle of their shoulders, the weight of their silence. The second man, the scarred one, hadn't said much. He didn't need to. The longer he stayed quiet, the more the air seemed to tighten around him. Then Silas reached forward, slowly, openly, fingers spreading toward Marie's hair, as if he had the right to touch whatever he wanted. Jon moved without drama. He caught Silas's wrist in his hand, firm, controlled. Not a blow, not a shove, a warning delivered through pressure. Silas's smile slipped away. The easy charm fell off his face like a mask. The scarred man produced a pistol as if he'd been holding it in his thoughts the whole time. He didn't wave it around. He simply aimed it at Jon's ribs, close enough that Jon could see the dull wear on the metal. "Let go," the scarred man said. Jon released Silas's wrist slowly and lifted his hands.
He didn't raise his voice, he didn't plead. He only shifted his body slightly between the men and his family, like instinct had drawn a line. Silas looked at Jon with offense, like Jon had broken an unspoken rule of the world. I don't like secrets. I don't like foreign languages. Then he pulled a knife and brought it up near Creston's cheek, not cutting, just hovering there, a promise made of steel. Creston froze. His eyes went wide and wet, and he made a small sound, more breath than voice. Marie's face went pale, but she didn't collapse. She held herself upright, the way women do when they understand they can't afford to fall apart. The scarred man pressed the pistol harder toward Jon. Off the wagon. Now. Walk. Don't look back. Jon nodded once. He stepped down into the dust with his hands raised. The sun hit him hard, and the world felt suddenly too bright, too wide. The wagon rolled forward again. Jon walked beside it, trying to keep pace, trying to keep his eyes on Marie and Creston through the shifting canvas and the sway of wheels. For a while, the wagon turned slightly behind the patch of scrub, and Jon couldn't see inside. That was all it took. When the wagon cleared the scrub again, Creston was no longer on the bench. Jon heard a scream that never finished. The desert swallowed the sound the way it swallows footprints. Jon ran after the wagon, not like a hero, like a father whose body has forgotten how to be careful. His boots pounded through ruts and loose sand, and each step felt like trying to run through water. But he was too late. He found his son by the roadside, small, still, and wrong in a way the mind refuses to accept at first. No blood on display, no spectacle, just the terrible silence of a child who should have been laughing. Jon dropped to his knees in the dust and gathered Creston into his arms. He pressed his face into the boy's hair, as if warmth could be pushed back into him through sheer will. His shoulders shook once, then got rigid, like grief had turned to stone inside him. He carried Creston for nearly a mile, not because it made sense, because letting go didn't. At some point, he set him down gently and stood over him. His shadow stretched long across the dirt, and the sun kept shining like it hadn't noticed the world break. Jon looked at the wagon tracks, at the drag marks, at the crushed brush. He didn't speak. He didn't curse. His face changed into something older than anger, something that looked like focus. He followed. He moved across the scrubland with the quiet precision of a man who'd once been trained to hunt men instead of animals. The land around him was open, but he treated it like cover. He watched for movement, for smoke, for anything out of place. By late afternoon, he found them near an arroyo. Horses tied, a faint curl of smoke, the men careless enough to believe the world belonged to them. Jon took cover behind the rock and raised his revolver. His hands didn't tremble. His breathing steadied. Whatever was left of the man who wanted peace stepped aside. One shot, then another. The scarred man went down without drama, collapsing like a sack with its strings cut. Silas spun, startled, suddenly understanding he wasn't the predator anymore. Silas ran, coattails flapping, boots slipping on loose gravel. He stopped and turned back, hands lifted halfway, mouth moving in frantic denial. He begged, he lied, he tried to bargain. Jon stepped closer, revolver leveled, eyes flat. And then it ended.
By sundown, the desert had already carried the story into town, faster than any horse, faster than any telegraph line that bothered to work out here. 2 men were found near a dry arroyo, laid out in the dust like they'd been dropped there on purpose. No one in Black Creek said their names at first. Folks just called them the bodies, the way people do when they're trying not to invite trouble by speaking too clearly. But everyone understood what it meant. Someone had fought back. And in a place like ours, that didn't feel like justice. It felt like a match struck too close to dry grass. I didn't see the bodies myself, not that first day. I heard about them in the general store, in the pauses between half-whispered sentences. Men leaned in over sacks of flour and pretended they were talking about prices, while their eyes kept sliding to the windows, like danger might be standing out there, listening. Somebody said the dead men had been dragged. Somebody else said the shots were clean, too clean for a drunk, too steady for a frightened farmer. Then the talk turned, the way it always does, toward strangers, toward the Danish brothers. Jon Jensen had been in our valley for years by then, quiet as a fence post. Peter Jensen, his brother, was the one who smiled and joked and made folks forget just for a moment that the West doesn't hand out kindness for free. People liked Peter because he looked like he belonged in a story with a better ending. Jon didn't look like he belonged anywhere. What nobody in town understood yet, what even Jon didn't know, was that one of the dead men wasn't just any highway thief. He was Silas Delarue. And Silas had a brother. Henry Delarue rode into Black Creek a few days later like the devil collecting on a promise. I remember that morning clear as a knife edge. The street was already tense, even before the dust showed up at the far end of town. Then the dust thickened and shapes came riding through it. Hard men on horseback, rifles slung, faces hidden under hat brims. Henry was in front. He wore a faded Union cavalry coat long after the war had ended, like he couldn't accept that the world had stopped giving him reasons to kill. He sat his horse the way officers sit, straight-backed, calm, looking down his nose at everything. And that calm was worse than shouting. It meant he didn't need to prove anything. He dismounted slow, boots hitting our street like punctuation. Mayor Nathan Keene came out to meet him, doing that careful walk a man does when he knows one wrong word might get him buried. Keene wore his black coat like a preacher most days, and an undertaker when business required it. In Black Creek, you didn't just have one job. You had whatever jobs kept you alive. Henry didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "You got bodies on my land," he said. Keene spread his hands and tried to sound official, tried to sound like the law meant something. Henry cut that off with a look. Henry scanned the street, storefronts, hitching rail, water trough, like he was deciding what to break first. Then he said what he came to say. He wanted the killer. By noon the next day. And if the town didn't give him the man responsible, he'd take 2 people from Black Creek instead. Not the loud ones, not the tough ones. 2 ordinary souls. Innocent, if that word still mattered. It wasn't a threat made out of rage. It was business. Henry Delarue negotiated with grief the way other men negotiated with money. You could feel the town shrink after that. Doors closed, curtains pulled. People avoided eye contact in the street like guilt might be contagious. Henry's riders drifted toward the edge of town and made camp like they were settling in for a long stay. Horses tied to posts, bedrolls rolled out, a small fire, barely more than coals, men with rifles sitting like they had every right to be there. And suddenly Black Creek felt cut off from the world in a way that went deeper than distance. It felt forgotten on purpose. Sheriff Malachi Rourke tried to do what sheriffs do in stories. He tried to bargain. In real life, bargaining with men like Henry Delarue is like bargaining with a drought. You can talk all you want. It doesn't change what's coming. Rourke rode out to the Jensen claim with 2 deputies. I wasn't with them, but I heard enough afterward, and I saw the look on Peter's face when they brought him back. Peter met them on the porch. He had that half smile he used when he wanted to keep things light, like humor could turn bullets into air. "You bringing coffee?" he asked, "or trouble?" They brought trouble. By evening, Peter was in the jailhouse, his cheeks swelling where someone had introduced a fist to his face. The deputies acted like they'd done their job, like they'd collected a man and solved a problem. But all they'd done was make the town smaller and Henry Delarue bigger. Jon stood outside the jail and watched the door like he could see through it. He didn't yell. He didn't beg. He just stood there, shoulders stiff, eyes cold, the kind of stillness that makes other men uncomfortable because it doesn't give them anything to push against. Sheriff Rourke came out and spoke to Jon like a man asking permission to fail. He told Jon the truth in plain terms. Henry wanted someone to pay. The town needed time. Maybe, if they handed over the killer, the government might eventually remember Black Creek existed. Jon listened, his face unmoving. Rourke hesitated before saying the part he didn't want to say. "If you don't give Delarue what he wants," the sheriff admitted, "he'll butcher us until someone stops him." Jon's eyes stayed on the jailhouse door. "And if I do give him what he wants?" Jon asked. Rourke didn't answer right away, because the answer tasted like ash. Then he said it anyway. "He'll butcher you first." That's the kind of math the West runs on. Not fair, not even logical, just brutal and consistent. I was nearby that night, hiding where a boy can hide, behind stacked hay bales in a feed trough, trying to see without being seen. I didn't know why I watched. Maybe because fear makes you curious. Maybe because the older you get out here, the more you start studying trouble the way you study weather. I saw Jon's face when the sheriff said those words. It didn't change much on the outside, but something shifted behind his eyes, like a door closing quietly. Not rage. Decision. And I remember thinking, even then, that the town was getting it wrong. Everyone kept talking about the Danish brothers like they were the problem, like they were the spark. But the spark wasn't the men we've dragged into our dust. The spark was Henry Delarue riding in with a cavalry coat and a smile that didn't belong to a human being. That night, Black Creek didn't sleep. The wind kept moving through the street, lifting dust and tapping loose signs like a slow, nervous heartbeat. The camp at the edge of town glowed faintly with firelight. Henry's riders laughed sometimes, short bursts that sounded like bottles breaking. And inside the jailhouse, Peter sat behind iron bars, quiet for once, watching the deputies and learning their rhythm. Jon stood outside in the dark and stared toward the outskirts camp. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, not because he wanted to jump, because he understood the ground beneath him was already gone. By morning, everyone in Black Creek knew what noon meant, and everyone knew they were waiting for someone else to bleed so they wouldn't have to.
By the time Henry Delarue settled into Black Creek like a thorn under the skin, folks stopped asking if trouble was coming and started asking who it would land on first. You could feel it in the way doors closed a little faster, in the way people kept their voices low, even inside their own homes, in the way the wind seemed louder, like it was trying to fill up all the empty space where courage used to be. Henry didn't just ride through town. He moved through it like a man walking the aisles of a store he already owned. And he had a system, clean, steady, practiced. He called it protection. The rest of us called it paying to keep breathing. He'd send his men down the boardwalk, one storefront at a time, a rifle slung loose at the shoulder, a hand resting near a holster like it was just comfortable there. No shouting, no frantic threats, just the quiet certainty that if you didn't hand over your coins, you'd hand over something worse. A shopkeeper would open the till with fingers that didn't quite work right anymore. A rancher would fish money out of his pocket like he was pulling out a tooth. Even the folks who tried to act tough, men who'd fought in other places, men who'd once believed in their own reputations, paid just the same. Because Henry wasn't impressed by talk, he only respected leverage. And if Henry Delarue was the blade, then the thing that unsettled people most was the velvet wrapped around it. Her name was Madeline. She rode behind him most days, side saddle on a dark mare, gloved hands folded in her lap, chin level, eyes forward. Folks said she was Silas Delarue's widow, said she belonged to the family like a piece of furniture that had been moved from one room to another. They also said she was mute. Maybe she was, maybe she wasn't. Out here, people call a woman mute the moment she stops wasting words on men who don't deserve them. What mattered was her silence didn't feel soft, it felt locked. When Henry collected money, Madeline stayed close enough to be seen and far enough to be untouched by the work. Like a symbol Henry carried around to remind everyone he could take anything and still look civilized doing it. The town started calling her the princess, half mocking and half afraid. But there was nothing princess-like about her eyes. Those eyes were sharp, exhausted, watchful, like she'd been awake for years. Tom Ibarra noticed her first. He was 16, lean as a fence rail, with that desert boy habit of watching grown men make mistakes. He'd seen Henry ride in. He'd seen the gang spread through town like smoke. But when he saw Madeline sitting behind Henry, something in him tightened. It wasn't pity, not exactly. It was recognition. Because Tom knew what it looked like when somebody's body was free, but their life wasn't. His grandmother, Abuela Ibarra, ran a small shop on the edge of the main street. Nails, flour, kerosene, rope. The kind of place where people came for supplies and left with rumors. Abuela had lived long enough to stop believing in happy endings, but she still believed in paying attention. That evening, she counted the day's coins with a tired face, then set the little pile aside like it offended her. Protection, she muttered, like the word tasted dirty. Tom stood near the window, watching Henry's men ride back toward their camp. He kept glancing at Madeline's silhouette. She didn't say a single word, Tom said quietly. Abuela can look up. Smart woman. Tom frowned. You think she can talk? Abuela finally lifted her eyes, calm and sharp. I think she doesn't talk to people who can't help her. And then she did what grandmothers do in places like Black Creek. She gave Tom work. Something to keep his hands busy and mind from wandering into fear. Take grain out to their camp, she told him, and keep your eyes down. You hear me? Eyes down. Tom didn't like it, but he obeyed. Because a boy can argue with the desert, but it won't change the heat. He hoisted the sack, tied it off, and started walking. By the time he reached the outskirts, dusk had turned the world amber. Henry's camp sat out there like a weighing animal. Horses tied to rough posts, bedrolls thrown down, rifles leaning against saddles. A small fire burned low. The men around it laughed in short bursts, like breaking twigs. Tom stopped at the edge of the light, holding the sack like it was his passport. One of the gang looked up and stared at him with bored hostility. The man didn't ask Tom's name, didn't need to. He just jerked his chin toward the ground, telling him where to drop the grain. He did it quickly, knees bending under the weight, the sack thumping into dust. He kept his eyes down, like Abuela said. But that's the thing about telling a boy not to look. His eyes will find trouble anyway. And there she was. Madeline sat a little apart from the men, near the edge of a lantern's glow. She wasn't laughing, she wasn't eating, she was writing. A small notebook in her lap, a pencil moving fast. Then, after a moment, she tore a page out and crumpled it. Wrote again, tore again, like she was rehearsing a kind of courage that didn't come naturally anymore. Tom hesitated. He should have left right then, he knew it. But curiosity is a stubborn disease, and the frontier doesn't cure it gently. He edged a little closer. Madeline looked up. Just one glance, and Tom felt like he'd stepped into deep water. Her eyes weren't wide or pleading. They were measured, assessing, like she was deciding whether he was a threat or a tool. Tom nodded politely, the way he'd been raised. Ma'am. Madeline didn't answer. Of course she didn't. She simply lifted the notebook toward him, holding it so he could see the page.
Tom couldn't read much. His letters were shaky, and words didn't always behave for him, but he could read that. Run. The word hit him like a slap. Tom's throat tightened. He flicked his gaze toward the men by the fire, toward Henry, sitting back in his chair like the night belonged to him. Madeline's eyes shifted, not to the men, not to Henry, toward the town lights in the distance. Run. Her mouth shaped silently, as if remembering what sound used to feel like. Tom backed away so fast he nearly tripped over his boots. He forced himself not to bolt, because bolting would get attention. Instead, he walked. Then, once he was out of the lantern's reach, he ran. He ran until the campfire glow disappeared behind him, and the town's lanterns grew larger. He ran like the desert itself was chasing him. When he burst into Abuela's shop, he was breathing hard, face flushed, dust streaking his cheeks. Abuela looked up from her table, unimpressed by panic until it earned her respect. Tom bent over, hands on his knees, trying to speak. He started, then swallowed. The woman, Madeline. She showed me a word. Abuela's eyes narrowed. What word? Tom straightened and said it like it might explode if he held it too long. Run. For a moment, Abuela didn't speak. She just stared at the lamp flame like it might tell her whether the world had finally tipped over. Then she poured herself a cup of chicory coffee, dark, bitter, the kind of drink that tastes like experience. Her hand didn't shake. That's what scared Tom most. She took one slow sip, set the cup down carefully, and finally looked at her grandson. Now the story begins. Outside, the wind scraped along the boardwalk and lifted dust into thin ribbons. The town felt too quiet, like it was saving its breath for something worse. And out there at Henry's camp, Madeline sat with her notebook in her lap, tearing page after page, building up courage and scraps. Because when a woman like that tells a boy to run, she isn't trying to save him. She's trying to warn the town that whatever's coming
By the time
is going to
the
come fast.
sun climbed over Black Creek and turned the tar flats into a sheet of dull black shine, Sheriff Malachi Rourke was already riding toward Henry Delarue's camp with his hat in his hands. That's how you could tell the day was going to go bad. A lawman doesn't take his hat off unless he's praying, apologizing, or surrendering. Rourke wasn't the kind of sheriff you read about in dime novels. He was Irish, tired, and worn down by years of trying to keep order in a place that didn't believe in it. He had deputies, sure, but deputies don't mean much when the men you're facing carry rifles and don't fear hanging. Henry Delarue stood at the edge of his camp like he'd been waiting. He didn't pace, he didn't fidget. He just watched the sheriff ride in, calm as a man watching weather roll across open land. Rourke tried to bargain anyway. He spoke plain. He offered Jon Jensen in exchange for the town's safety. He tried to make it sound like a deal men could accept and walk away from. Henry looked at him the way a gambler looks at a poor hand, almost amused by the effort. "Why would I leave?" Henry asked, quiet and pleasant. "This place is profitable." Rourke swallowed, and you could see the truth settle on him. The town wasn't negotiating for peace. It was negotiating for time. Maybe time for help to arrive. Maybe time for the Delarue storm to pass. Maybe time for people to run. Henry stepped a little closer, not threatening with motion, just with presence. And then he made his real demand without shouting or sweating or losing his temper. He didn't want hanging. Hanging was too quick, too clean, too much like justice. Henry wanted a lesson. So when Rourke returned to Black Creek, the deal he brought back wasn't a deal at all. It was a sentence, and it had a slow death attached to it. They took Jon Jensen and marched him to the edge of town, where an abandoned stable sat half-collapsed under sun and wind. Out front stood a rough wooden post, sun-bleached and splintered, like it had been waiting for years to be used for something ugly. Men tied Jon to it, wrists bound, shoulders pulled tight against the wood. Jon didn't plead, didn't spit, didn't curse in Danish or English. He simply stood there and breathed through the pain like a man who'd learned that panic wastes air. Henry arrived with Malene at his side. She stood quiet, gloved hands folded, eyes fixed on Jon like she was being forced to watch a thing she'd already seen too many times. Jon lifted his head and tried to speak, to tell her what Silas had done, what had been taken from him, what kind of man her family truly was. His voice was hoarse, but the anger in it was sharp. Henry didn't let him finish. He stepped in and drove a fist into Jon's face, one clean, brutal punch that crocked the moment like a branch underfoot. Jon's head snapped sideways, cheek pressed to the post for a heartbeat. Then he straightened again, slowly, stubbornly, the kind of stubborn you can't teach. Henry leaned in close, almost curious. "We will soon find out what you're made of," his mouth said. Then he turned away, satisfied. And that was the cruelty of it. Henry didn't stay to watch. He didn't have to. He trusted the sun.
They left Jon tied out there with no water and no shade, under a sky that didn't care what kind of man you were. Hours passed. Heat shimmered above the dirt like the air was melting. Sweat dried into salt on Jon's skin. Flies circled. Somewhere high above, vultures began their slow, patient spirals. They knew what a post in the sun usually meant. From a distance, townsfolk watched and did nothing. Some hid behind fences, some watched from windows. Nobody stepped forward, because fear makes a crowd smaller than a single brave person. The sheriff went to the chapel and sat alone, hat in his lap, head bowed. Maybe he prayed. Maybe he just tried to keep from vomiting. A man can only carry so many compromises before they start to rot inside him. Out by the post, Jon's lips cracked. His throat worked as he tried to swallow. The rope bit into his wrists. Still he didn't fall. Still he didn't beg. Late in the afternoon, Mayor Nathan Keene approached. At first, it almost looked like mercy. He carried a tin cup. He moved slowly, cautious, like he was trying to look helpful without drawing attention from the wrong eyes. But he didn't lift the cup to Jon's mouth. He crouched and reached for Jon's boots. That's when the town learned what kind of Keene really was. Jon lifted his head, eyes sun-glazed but present, and watched as Keene tugged the boot off, spilled the hidden money into his palm, and smiled like a man stealing from the dead. "You hid money there," Keene muttered. "It was for land," Jon rasped back. Keene's grin flashed quick and ugly. Land's changing hands. Then Keene walked away with the coins and the boots, whistling a hymn like he was proud of himself. Back at the jailhouse, Peter Jensen waited. They'd locked him up like a stray dog and expected him to sit quietly. For the first day, he did. He watched, he listened. He learned the rhythm of the deputy's steps, the way keys swung, the way boredom made men careless. By the second day, Peter started talking. Not pleading, not bargaining, not begging. He mocked. He mocked the deputy's face, his posture, his life. He did it with that sharp, irritating humor of his, the kind that makes a man furious because it's true enough to sting. The deputy tried to ignore him. Then he snapped. And that's the thing about anger. It makes men open doors they should keep closed. When the deputy unlocked the cell to teach Peter a lesson, Peter stepped aside like a dancer and struck once, fast and efficient. The deputy went down hard. Peter grabbed the keys, slipped out, and disappeared into the alleys before anyone understood what had happened. By then, evening had turned into night, and the air finally cooled. Clouds gathered, and rain came down. Thin at first, then heavier. The kind of rain that feels like the sky is trying to wash the land clean, even though it never does. Jon stood tied to the post, soaked and shivering now, the heat torture replaced by cold misery. He lifted his face slightly to catch the water on his lips, like a man drinking from the air. And in the dark, through the sound of rain, help finally arrived. Peter moved like a shadow, boots quiet in mud, knife in hand. He cut the rope fast, caught Jon as he slumped forward, and dragged him away from the post before anyone noticed. Jon's weight was heavy, real and deadened by thirst and beating. Peter hauled him like a man hauling a piece of his own body. They made it to a horse. Peter boosted Jon up into the saddle, then climbed on himself, guiding the reins with one hand and holding Jon steady with the other. Behind them, somewhere in the town, a shout went up. Then another. The escape had been seen. Riders were mounting. Lantern light bobbed in the distance. Hoofs began to drum against wet ground. And as Peter pushed the horse into the night, pulling his brother away from that post and that sun and that slow death, the truth settled in like a stone. They weren't just running from Henry Delarue anymore. They were running from the whole town's fear, because fear has a way of feeding the monster, even when it swears it doesn't mean to.
Out past Black Creek, the night has a way of swallowing footsteps. It swallows prayers too, if you say them out loud. And that night, when the rain finally came, it wasn't the gentle kind that farmers thank God for. It was the kind that turns dust into paste and makes every shadow look like it's holding a gun. Jon Jensen was barely holding on to his saddle. His wrists were raw from the rope. His lips split from the sun and Henry Delarue's fist, and his eyes kept drifting shut like his body was trying to quit on him in pieces. Peter rode tight beside him, one hand on his own reins, the other ready to catch Jon if he tipped too far. They didn't speak much. There wasn't room for words. Every breath had to count. Behind them, somewhere in the dark, lanterns bobbed. Hooves beat the wet ground. Henry's riders were out there, spreading through the scrub like a pack that didn't need to see you clearly to know where you were. Peter did something smart before the fear could do something stupid. When two shapes broke out of the brush ahead, two of Delarue's men trying to cut them off, Peter didn't hesitate. He drew his revolver like it belonged to his hand and fired with the cold precision of a man who decided he'd rather be hunted than helpless. One rider slumped and slid off his horse. The other turned startled, and Peter fired again. The second man folded forward and tumbled into the mud. No theatrics, no shouting, just the hard, short punctuation of gunfire and the hiss of rain on dust. But killing two men doesn't end a chase. It just announces one. Peter urged the horses onward. Jon's head sagged, then lifted again. His hand slipped on the saddle horn. He tried to brace himself, tried to stay upright through stubbornness alone.
For a few minutes, it almost worked. Then his body betrayed him. His grip failed and he slid sideways out of the saddle. He hit the ground with a heavy, wet thud, more a collapse than a fall. The horse kept moving a few steps before it stopped, confused. Peter was off his own horse in an instant. He grabbed Jon under the arms and dragged him toward a big boulder that rose out of the scrub like a dark tooth. Jon's boots carved lines in the mud. Peter's shoulders strained with the weight. He didn't curse. He didn't panic. He worked like a man hauling someone out of a burning building. He pressed Jon's back against the rock and checked his face, quick and urgent. Rainwater ran off Peter's hat brim and splattered Jon's cheek. Jon's eyes fluttered, unfocused. Peter shoved Jon's revolver into his hand and curled Jon's fingers around the grip like he was teaching him how to hold on to life. Jon's hand trembled, but it stayed closed. Then Peter leaned in close, so close he could be heard over the rain. "They'll ride right past," Peter whispered, more to himself than to Jon. "They won't stop, not if they think I'm still running." He tried to smile. It was a thin, wrong thing on his bruised face, humor drug up from a dry well. A last little trick, like he was trying to remind Jon that Peter Jensen didn't go quietly into anything. And then he mounted his horse and rode out from behind the rock alone. He didn't just ride away, he made sure he could be seen, just enough to draw the eyes, just enough to pull the storm off his brother. Lantern lights swung in the distance, hooves turned. The pursuers shifted course like wolves catching a scent. The riders followed Peter. Jon lay behind the boulder and tried to stay awake. The rain eased, the night cooled, his eyelids grew heavy. The last thing he remembered was the sound of hoofbeats fading, and then the desert went quiet in that way it does when it's satisfied. When dawn came, it came pale and cruel. The storm clouds had moved on, the world looked washed but not clean. Jon stirred in the cold light, his mouth dry again, his tongue thick. He pushed himself up and swayed, the horizon wobbling like it was hung on a loose nail. He crawled first, then forced his knees under him, then stood, shaking. He saw a shallow depression in the ground that held a puddle, muddy, dark, and still. It didn't look like much, but thirst doesn't ask for quality, it only asks for now. Jon dropped to his knees and drank. The water tasted wrong, bitter, oily. He coughed and spat, black smearing his lips. He wiped his mouth with his sleeve and tried to swallow again anyway. That's when he saw movement. Far off, through the shimmer of heat rising even in morning, a rider crossed the flats. Something dragged behind the saddle on a rope, bouncing over the ground with each step of the horse. Jon squinted, blinking hard, trying to make the world behave, and then his chest tightened like a fist closing inside him. It was Peter. Not walking, not riding, not waving like he'd found a shortcut. Just Peter. Limp and being pulled through dust like a sack of grain. Jon stood frozen. He didn't scream, he didn't run. He couldn't. His body was a ruined thing, and his mind was trying to refuse what his eyes were insisting on. When the rider passed far enough that the shape was unmistakable, Jon's face changed, not into rage. Rage would have been easier. It changed into something flat and empty, like all the sound had been pulled out of him. Somewhere in the distance, Black Creek kept breathing like nothing had happened. Back in Delarue's world, things were cracking too, just in a different direction. Henry returned to his headquarters in town and found his iron safe yawning open like a broken mouth. The oil money, bundles of bills that smelled like city hands and dirty deals, was gone. Papers were scattered. The lockbox tray sat overturned like someone had torn the guts out of his control. Henry didn't shout at first, he just stood there, jaw clenched, eyes cutting from corner to corner as he counted betrayals. Then the hunt began, this time for someone from inside his own shadow. Melline had taken it. The mute woman, the quiet one, the one everyone thought was only decoration. She moved fast, slipping through the smoke of yesterday's violence and the confusion of men who'd never believed she could act. She got to the train station with a heavy canvas bag pulling her shoulder down, the money inside thudding against her hip with every step. She stood on the platform in the dirty morning light, steam curling around her like a ghost trying to hide her. For a moment, just a moment, she looked like she might actually make it. Then Henry arrived. He rode in hard, dust and steam mixing around his horse's legs. He dismounted fast and closed the distance like a man who didn't have to ask permission. Melline saw him. Her face went tight and she backed up one pace. Not enough. Henry struck her. One slap, sharp and ugly, snapping her head sideways. The sound cut through the station like a gunshot without smoke. Melline steadied herself, blood at her mouth. And then she did the last thing Henry expected. She spit it back onto him. Not the kind of spit that comes from fear, the kind that comes from hatred so old it settled into the bones. Henry's hand went to his pistol, reflex and rage. For a split second, it looked like he might kill her right there between steam and telegraph poles. But his right-hand man stepped in, calm as a banker. He spoke close to Henry, eyes flicking to the money bag like it was a reason, not a sin. Melline was still useful, he implied. Henry lowered the pistol slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. Melline didn't flinch, she didn't look away. She just stood there, breathing hard, silent and furious, while the train hissed behind her like it was disappointed. They dragged her away from the steps. The West doesn't let people leave clean. Meanwhile, Jon Jensen wandered. He moved through the dry land near Black Creek like a man half made of dust himself, staggering, stopping, starting again. His mouth was still blackened from that puddle, his eyes burned with fever and sun. By midday, he found a ranch house beyond town with a windmill that creaked like old joints. There was a well out front. From a distance, it looked like salvation. A woman stepped out with a shotgun before Jon could reach the yard. Mrs. Whitaker was the kind of widow the frontier produces when it takes everything else. Tough, armed, and unimpressed by strangers. She raised the gun and fired a warning shot into the dirt at Jon's feet, dust jumping up in a small, violent cloud. "Stop," her posture said, even if her words didn't carry. Jon didn't stop. Not because he was brave, because thirst and grief had burned away his sense of self-preservation. He walked straight toward the well like it was the only thing holding the world together. Mrs. Whitaker aimed again, then hesitated as she saw his face, saw the way he moved, saw the hallowed outlook that wasn't drunkenness or aggression. It was loss. John reached the well and lowered a tin cup on a rope. When he pulled it back up, it came dripping thick black crude instead of water.
Black Creek wasn't built on a creek. Not really. It was built on a rumor, on a dark stain in the earth that looked worthless until the right kind of men started putting numbers to it. Out beyond town, where the tar flats spread like a burn scar, the ground seeped black and slow. In the morning light, it shined like dull glass. Folks around here called it a curse, or a curiosity, depending on whether they needed land or needed hope. But men in distant cities didn't call it either of those things. They called it potential. A few days after Henry Delarue tightened his grip on Black Creek, a train whistled into a little rail stop nearby, the kind of station that barely deserved the name, just weathered boards, a telegraph pole, and a water tower that creaked like an old throat. The steam rolled out low and dirty, mixing with dust, as if the locomotive itself didn't approve of stopping here. Two men stepped down in city suits, hats clean, hands gloved, white men with soft palms and hard eyes. They carried leather cases that looked heavier than paperwork usually does. The desert hit them the moment they stepped onto the platform. Heat, grit, the smell of dry wind, and you could see them decide without speaking that this was a place you controlled from a distance. They didn't come to talk to ranchers. They came to talk to power. Back in Black Creek, Mayor Nathan Keene received them in his office like he was welcoming guests, but his smile was the kind a man wears when he's afraid of both sides. The oil men kept their hats on. They kept their voices low. They slid a packet of documents across Keene's desk and opened a case just enough for him to see bundled cash stacked tight. It wasn't charity. It was instruction. Outside, Henry Delarue waited as if he'd been invited. When the suited men stepped out again, Henry took the money without gratitude. Their mouths moved in warnings, careful ones, about keeping his violence from becoming inconvenient, about how the territory had been cut loose, how no federal help was coming, how sheriff work could wave a badge all day and no one in Washington would care. Henry listened like a man listening to weather forecasts. Then he tucked the cash away and strolled off as if the town had just paid rent. That was the real shape of it. Black Creek wasn't forgotten by the world. It was being sold. And while men with money made quiet deals in daylight, the people trapped under those deals tried to survive the nights. The telegraph office sat dark most evenings. The key went untouched. Dust gathered on the table where messages should have lived. It was a small, ugly detail, but it told the truth. Even if Black Creek screamed, nobody outside would hear. That same night, Henry's camp burned low at the edge of town. Horses shifted in their ties. Men lounged with rifles like they were just taking a break from honest work. And Madeline sat apart from them all, in shadow and firelight, quiet as ever. Folks around here called her mute, like it explained everything. It didn't. Madeline's silence wasn't emptiness, it was containment. She watched Henry's movements the way a prisoner watches a guard's habits. When the men drinking and laughing grew sloppy, she stayed still. When the fire sank and the camp quieted, she moved. Not fast, not frantic, carefully. She slipped behind a wagon at the edge of camp, lifted her skirt just enough to avoid noise, and crossed into the dark. The wind tried to pull at her coat as if it wanted to expose her. She didn't fight it. She simply kept going, feet placed like she was stepping across thin ice. Tom saw her. Tom was just a boy by the calendar, 16, lean, half-raised by desert wind and a grandmother's strict rules. But she'd already learned that the West makes children into witnesses. He'd been watching Henry's camp from a distance, the way you watch a rattlesnake, careful, fascinated, and too close for comfort. When he saw Madeline leave, something in him tightened. Not romance, not heroism, just that stubborn, foolish feeling that the quiet people are often the ones who know where the knives are buried. So Tom followed. He stayed back far enough to avoid being heard, slipping through scrub and broken ground. Ahead of him, Madeline headed toward the tar flats, where the earth shone black in places even under moonlight. The night out there felt colder, emptier, like the desert was holding its breath. An abandoned schoolhouse waited near the seep, one room, crooked, peeling paint, porch boards that complained if you stepped wrong. It looked like the kind of building the frontier forgets until someone needs it for something secret. Madeline slipped inside. Tom crept to the doorway and watched through cracks in the wood. Inside, she knelt on the floor and pried up a loose board. Her hands didn't shake much, which told Tom this wasn't a first attempt. She pulled out a metal lockbox, dusty, scuffed, hidden deep like a sin. A key hung at her neck on a ribbon. She used it quickly like she'd memorized the feel of it. When the box opened, moonlight caught the edges of stacked cash and folded paper stained with oily fingerprints. Deeds, contracts, the kind of paper that changes who owns the ground under your feet. Madeline stuffed what she could into a cloth bag, the bag stacked with weight. She moved faster now, breath controlled, urgency sharpening her motions. Then she paused. Her head turned toward the doorway. Tom felt his stomach drop because he understood that moment, when you realize the quiet has changed. He stepped into view anyway, hands visible, empty. A boy trying to look harmless in a world that doesn't reward harmless. Madeline's eyes locked on him, sharp and exhausted. She didn't scream, she didn't run. She just stared, measuring him, like deciding whether he was another danger or maybe the smallest chance at help. Tom swallowed. "Ma'am," he whispered, though no sound mattered much. Madeline raised a small notebook toward him, not like a plea, more like a command. The page wasn't for poetry, it was for survival. She gestured toward town, then made a quick shooing motion, eyes hard. "Go, leave, now." Tom started backing away, careful not to scrape his boots on the porch boards. And then the night snapped. A branch cracked outside, too sharp, too close. A Delarue rider stepped into moonlight with a rifle in his hands, white face under a hot brim, eyes narrowed, coat dusty even in the dark. He looked at the schoolhouse like it was his property, and maybe in his mind it was. Tom froze, Madeline didn't. She
She moved first, scooping dust and flinging it through the doorway into the man's face. It bloomed pale in the moonlight like smoke. The rider staggered, cursing silently, wiping at his eyes, rifle dipping. Madeline darted out the side of the building into the darkness, bag clutched tight. Tom turned and ran the other way, hard trying to punch its way out of his ribs. The rifle fired. The bullet didn't hit flesh, it hit old wood, splinters exploding from the schoolhouse wall. The sound rolled across the tar flats and vanished into open desert, like even the echo didn't want to stay. Tom stumbled through brush, then stopped, breath ragged, because he saw something else move in the shadows. Jon Jensen rose from behind a mesquite like a man pulled up from the ground. He looked worse than the last time anyone in town had seen him, dusty, wounded, hollowed out. But his hands were steady, and the revolver in his grip wasn't a threat, it was a fact. The delivery rider blinked through dust, trying to bring the world back into focus. Jon didn't give him time. One shot, clean, controlled. The rider dropped backward into the dirt, rifle falling away. No show, no anger, just the quiet, final correction of a man who'd run out of patience for predators. Tom stood there staring, chest heaving, the boy's fear turning into stunned disbelief. He'd heard rumors about Jon Jensen, quiet farmer, foreigner, dangerous maybe, but seeing him like this was different. This wasn't luck, this was skill. Jon didn't look at the dead man for long. He looked past Tom, toward where Madeline had vanished. "She's here," he said. It wasn't a question. Tom nodded because his voice wouldn't work. Jon limped toward the schoolhouse, moving with the careful control of someone who knew pain well and didn't intend to let it make decisions for him. Inside, Madeline had crouched in a corner, bag tight against her chest. When Jon stepped into the doorway, she didn't flinch away like a frightened woman. She watched him like an equal threat, gun or no gun, because she learned what men do when they feel entitled. For a moment, they just stood there, two survivors measuring the shape of the other's damage. Jon spoke quietly, rough with fatigue. "You were Silas's wife." Madeline's jaw tightened, her eyes flickered with something bitter and old. She opened her notebook and wrote fast, then held it up. She wasn't his wife, not in the way the word should mean. Then she wrote again, slower this time, like it cost more. "Henry owns everything, even the dead. And finally, I want out." Jon stared at the words.
By the time the smoke from the burned coffin started to thin, people in Black Creek realized something they weren't used to feeling. Hope. Not the sweet kind, not the kind you put in a sermon, the rough kind that tastes like dust and fear, and maybe, just maybe, payback. Jon Jensen didn't make speeches. He didn't rally the town on the boardwalk. He didn't even ask for help the way most men would. He just started preparing, the way a soldier prepares when he's already accepted that whatever happens next is going to hurt. He went into town at first light and bought kerosene with money that should have been his all along, money he'd taken back from Mayor Keene in the night, at gunpoint, with a calm that made Keene's knees shake worse than any threat. Jon didn't enjoy it. He simply corrected the balance. Then he gathered what he needed: rope, nails, ammunition, and a couple sticks of old blasting powder that had been hidden away from earlier days when men still believed mines might save them. Meanwhile, down in Abuela Ibarra's cellar, Meline sat among jars and sacks, a quiet shape in lamplight. She wrote in her notebook and tore pages out, then wrote again, as if she was trying to carve a clean sentence out of a life that had never been clean. She didn't ask for comfort. She didn't offer explanations. She just waited, alert, listening, ready to move when the door finally appeared. Tom Ibarra was waiting too, though he didn't know what for. Abuela handed him cartridges with a look that said, "If you're going to be foolish, be useful." Tom climbed to a rooftop with a rifle that felt too heavy for his shoulders and tried not to think about what bullets do to living things. Morning came hard and bright, the kind of sun that makes everything look exposed. In the center of town, Jon rolled in on a wagon carrying a plain wooden coffin. That coffin changed the air immediately. People peeked out from behind posts and curtains. Mayor Keene went pale at the sight of it, because he understood what Jon was doing, turning death into theater. Henry Delarue didn't just like violence, he liked messages. Jon was about to send one. Henry was waiting at the outskirts camp, watching like a man enjoying a show he believed he couldn't lose. He stepped into town with his coat hanging off him like a uniform from a war that never ended. His men followed, spreading out with lazy confidence, rifles slung, eyes scanning rooftops and windows. Jon stopped the wagon in the street and climbed down slowly. He didn't flinch, he didn't hurry. He stood beside the coffin like it belonged to him, which, in a way, it did. The town had been burying itself for weeks, just a little at a time. Henry nodded once, and two of his men stepped forward to open it. The lid came up with a crack of nails and old wood. And what they found inside wasn't a body. It was paper. A priest's collar, Keene's collar, lay on top like a dirty joke. Beneath it were documents and deeds marked with oily fingerprints, contracts that smelled of city money and betrayal, the kind of proof that doesn't just accuse a man, it strips him naked in front of everyone. Henry's expression changed. His amusement drained away and left something colder. He barked an order. His men dragged the coffin to the side and doused it with kerosene. A torch touched the wood, and flames climbed fast, black smoke twisting up into the bright sky. That's when Jon lit the fuse. He'd already placed the blasting powder under the stable area where Henry kept horses and supplies, not to kill the whole town, just to break Henry's control, to shove the chessboard hard enough that pieces would scatter. The explosion wasn't a grand cannon blast. It was sharp, ugly, and effective. Planks snapped, dust and debris punched outward. Horses screamed and pulled against their ropes. Smoke rolled low and thick, and for a moment Henry's camp didn't look like an army. It looked like panic.
and panic is the one thing bullies can't stand. Tom fired from the rooftop. He wasn't smooth. He wasn't heroic. He was a boy trying to keep his hands steady while the world below him turned into shouting and smoke. He picked a man running between barrels and crates and squeezed the trigger the way Abuela taught him, slow, controlled. The gang member dropped behind cover, and Tom's stomach lurched, but he kept his position. Down on the street, Henry's men scrambled for angles. They moved in bursts from cover to cover, rifles coming up, boots thudding on the boardwalk. Henry shouted orders, cutting through the chaos like a whip. His men listened because fear works both ways. In the smoke and confusion, Malene moved. She slipped toward Henry's wagon where he kept the lockbox and the money, where he kept the illusion that everything belonged to him. She cut a strap with a small knife and dragged the lockbox down, muscles straining under the weight. Dust slicked under her boots. She didn't stop. She didn't look around for permission. Henry saw her, and the look on his face wasn't heartbreak. It wasn't betrayal in any tender sense. It was the rage of a man watching property walk away. He broke toward her, pushing through smoke and shouting men. Malene lifted her head and met his eyes. Fear flashed through her, then settled into something harder like steel cooling. Jon saw him moving, saw where the real danger was headed, and he stepped out from cover. That was Jon's mistake. Henry's rifle cracked once, and Jon dropped into the dust, hit in the side. He didn't tumble dramatically. He folded, heavy and real, pain knocking the air out of him. The revolver stayed in his hand, but his body didn't want to cooperate anymore. Henry approached slowly, savoring it, boots crunching over debris, smoke curling around his legs, the burned coffin still crackling on the edge of the street like a grim campfire. Henry stood over Jon and raised a pistol, calm as if finishing a job he'd started days ago. Malene was behind him, holding a revolver with both hands. Her arms trembled, not from weakness, but from fear fighting against decision. She aimed anyway. She fired once. The shot hit Henry in the shoulder, enough to stagger him, enough to crack his certainty. He turned toward her with disbelief, like he couldn't understand how a quiet woman could change the rules of the world. Henry lifted his pistol toward Malene, fury tightening his mouth. Jon, bleeding in the dust, forced his own revolver up with a shaking hand that still obeyed him. He didn't have time for anger. He didn't have room for hesitation. He fired once. Henry Delarue fell backward into the street, hat rolling away, smoke drifting over him as if the town itself exhaled. For a moment, everything went quiet except the soft crackle of fire and the distant restless sound of horses. The surviving gangmen hesitated. Some lowered their rifles. Some looked around like they'd just realized they were human again. That's when Sheriff Rourke arrived with federal marshals, late, as help usually is, but arriving all the same. Horses fanned out, rifles came up. The marshals moved with controlled purpose, surrounding what was left of Delarue's crew. Rourke stepped forward, eyes scanning the street, then landing on Jon in the dust and Malene standing nearby with the gun still in her hands. The sheriff's face tightened. Duty pulled one way, reality pulled another. He looked at Malene like she was a problem that needed chaining. Jon pushed himself up just enough to get between them, even half dead on his feet. "No," Jon said. Not loud, not pleading, just final. Rourke stared at him. The town watched from behind doors and posts, like they couldn't believe they were allowed to witness a turning point. Jon held the sheriff's gaze. "She's not his," he said. "She never was." Malene's gun lowered slowly. Her hands still shook, but her eyes didn't. Rourke looked around at Black Creek, at the smoke, the broken boards, the people who paid protection money with shaking hands. He looked at Henry's body in the dust like it was the end of a nightmare and the beginning of paperwork. Then he did something rare out here. He chose to let something go. He gave Jon.
A week after Henry Delarue fell in the dirt, Black Creek smelled different. Not cleaner, not kinder, just different. Like a room after a funeral, when the living have to keep breathing even though the air still feels owned by the dead. The smoke from the burned coffin thinned out, but the town kept the stain. Boards stayed scorched, windows stayed cracked. Horses still shied at sudden noises. Folks walked slower, as if the street might remember what happened and do it again. Sheriff Malachi Rourke did what sheriffs always do after the shooting stops. He tried to stock the world back into something that resembles order. Federal marshals took the surviving gangmen away in chains, rifles kept low, eyes kept hard. People watched from doorways like they were afraid to blink and wake up back inside the nightmare. And Mayor Nathan Keene? He vanished. No farewell, no apology, no, I was only trying to keep the town safe. Just an empty house and the kind of absence that feels deliberate. Some folks said he fled south before the marshals could put hands on him. Some said he took a horse in the night and rode until the desert decided he'd gone far enough. Tom Ibarra heard more than one version. He never bothered arguing for the truth. In places like Black Creek, the truth doesn't travel alone. It brings stories with it, like fleas.
Out past town, Mrs. Whitaker's ranch house became the quiet center of the aftermath. Not because it was warm or welcoming, Mrs. Whitaker wasn't built that way, but because Jon Jensen was there, and Jon Jensen wasn't dead. He healed slow. That bullet in his side didn't care about his stubbornness. Some mornings he could sit up without swaying, and some mornings he couldn't. Mrs. Whitaker fed him broth like she was repairing a fence, practical, impatient, and not interested in gratitude. She tightened his bandages, told him he smelled like tar and bad decisions, and then went right back to her work. Jon didn't argue with her. Arguing requires energy, and he was spending all of his on staying alive. Melanie stayed close, but not in the way folks in town expected. She didn't hover, she didn't play nurse, she didn't try to become anything soft. She simply existed near him, quiet, sharp-eyed, still carrying her notebook like it was a second spine. She'd sit in a corner with the lamp turned low and write things no one else could read. Then she'd close the book and stare out the window at the land as if she was memorizing a future she wasn't sure she deserved. They didn't speak much, not because there was nothing to say, but because the things worth saying had teeth. When Jon could finally stand and walk without looking like he might fold in half, he asked Mrs. Whitaker for a horse. She raised one eyebrow. "You can barely walk to the privy." Jon's voice stayed flat. "I'm walking farther than that." Mrs. Whitaker stared at him for a long moment, then tossed him a canteen and said, "Try not to fall off where coyotes can find you first." It wasn't a blessing, it was the closest thing she offered. Jon rode out to the small graveyard beyond Black Creek, where the ground was dry enough to feel offended by tears. The markers were rough boards with names scratched in like afterthoughts. The wind combed through dead grass, and the sky looked too wide for mourning. Peter Jensen's grave sat there with fresh dirt that had already started to harden. Jon stood over it a long time, hat in hand, shoulders stiff. No speech, no prayer. Then he reached into his coat and took out the tin of peppermints Peter had bought back at Sable Junction, back when hope still sat in their pockets like spare change. Jon set the tin on the grave gently, not like an offering to God, like an offering to memory. He stood there another moment, then turned and walked away without looking back, because looking back is how the desert convinces you to stay buried with what you lost. Melanie appeared at the edge of the graveyard as he left, silent as usual. She watched the peppermints tin catching a thin line of sun. Her face didn't soften exactly, but something in her eyes shifted like she recognized that particular kind of pain. Jon didn't ask her to come. He didn't have to. Back in town, Sheriff Rourke watched them from a distance, the way a man watches a storm move off into open country. He had duty on one side and exhaustion on the other. He had already been forced to choose what kind of law he could afford in a place like Black Creek. He had also seen the way Melanie had aimed that gun at Henry. He'd seen what it cost her. And he'd seen Jon Jensen put himself between her and the marshals like he was drawing a line in the dust. Rourke could have made it official, could have said she needed to answer questions, could have tried to pull her into the machinery of courts and papers. But Black Creek wasn't built for machinery. It was built for survival. So Rourke did something simple. He didn't stop them. He let the road take them before the town's guilt could turn into gratitude, and before gratitude could turn into expectation. Tom Avara watched them leave at dawn. He stood near his grandmother's shop with sleep still in his eyes and dust already on his boots. Black Creek behind him, open land ahead of them. Jon in the saddle, stuff as a man still stitched together by pain. Melanie riding like she'd been born knowing how to keep her balance. They didn't ride fast, they didn't ride like lovers in a storybook. They ride like people who had learned the world doesn't hand out second chances, and if you want one, you take it while it's still warm. Tom's grandmother leaned in the doorway with her arms crossed. Tom whispered, "Where do you think they're going?" Abobradara took a long look at the shrinking figures, then said, "Somewhere nobody knows their names." Tom frowned. "Is that even possible?" Aboyle snorted softly. "In the territory?" For a little while. And that was the truth of it. Years later, Tom heard the rumors. Everybody did. A quiet Danish gunman seen near the New Mexico line. A woman with sharp eyes who never spoke but could stare a man into honesty. A pair that moved like survivors, not sweethearts. Two people tied together by loss and the simple agreement that they'd rather face the world than yield to it. Maybe the rumors were true, maybe they weren't. The West loves decorating the past with extra paint. But Tom never chased them. He had his own life to build, and the desert doesn't give you time off just because you've already seen enough. Black Creek kept going too, because towns do, even ugly ones. The tar flats still seeped black under the sun. Vultures still circled when something died out on the road. Men still came through chasing land and luck. Sometimes they stay, sometimes they didn't. And every so often when the wind shifted just right, Tom would catch the faint smell of coal smoke and hot iron from the distant railroad. It would mix with the tar stink and the dry sage, and it would remind him of something he learned young. The frontier doesn't hand out endings, it hands out miles. And if you're stubborn and quiet and careful about where you place your feet, sometimes it lets you keep writing.